Hey everyone, this is Scott King, and thanks for joining this episode of the Union Podcast. So this episode's a little bit different. Chris and John talk amongst themselves about agentic platforms. They talk about 6 things that one of these platforms is going to contain, some of the things that you need to be looking for, and then John goes into detail on each one of the 6 attributes. It's a really informative podcast, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Chris and John.
So, John, there's a lot of hype all of a sudden in the last 3 weeks about agentic platforms. But no one's doing a good job of describing what it is and how it's going to help you.
Yeah, so an agentic platform is a new way to describe something that has been our mission since we founded in 2019. An agentic platform is built in order for you to produce autonomous agents. Those agents accomplish things that people currently have to accomplish, but instead, obviously, software is executing those particular tasks. Now, the immediate challenge that someone like us has, given our deep experience and history with having built and delivered this now to countless customers, is the orientation of an agentic platform should be toward outcomes and the focus be the organization. But in the spirit of how many seat licenses can I sell, lots of software companies don't think that way. They think more like they want you to have a virtual buddy for every one of your employees. And so they think more about what tasks does that individual need to do, and can we do some of those tasks? So an autonomous agent that accomplishes actually anything is a good thing, right? But what we really want is autonomous agents that are the perspective of the organization because they can own outcomes. And that means that autonomously identifying an outcome that needs to be executed, either by an external trigger or by an inbound email or by something that shows up on a feed or something, it doesn't matter, however, and then carry out the human capability steps through workflow, carry out the automation steps through really elegant integration of systems. And by the application of many types of AI, you can accomplish tremendously valuable outcomes with autonomous agents.
Okay, John, so what's inside an agentic platform? I'm sure there's 5 or 6 bullet points that people need to talk through.
Yeah, there's a set of key capabilities that are sort of the unlock. So first, an agentic platform is all about producing autonomous agents. These agents, to get created properly, are going to have a certain set of things we must be good at. One is low, or we would say no, code configuration. You got to be able to build these things very quickly and easily, change them, super important, even faster. You've got to integrate systems. It's got to be really easy, and integration is always the nightmare for making this stuff work seamlessly. And this is no different. We've got to solve for that nightmare of integrating systems. The third is we've got to integrate people, because an agent carrying out some interesting outcome is going to necessarily involve systems, people, and of course we'll talk AI in a second. And it's going to want to do that through a multi-channel engagement. We can't think of this as we're building old school UIs and we're pushing out new builds of software. We've got to be conversational in nature, and it's got to be able to converse in any channel we want. And then finally, it's a really good way to accidentally expose enormously sensitive company data and capabilities to people that don't deserve it and shouldn't see it. So we've got to have sufficient guardrails up. We've got to have a really elegant and easy to deploy, because if it's not easy, it's either going to be done wrong or it's not going to be done at all. We've got to have those guardrails up from a security perspective.
So let's drill into this a little bit. When people talk about low code configuration, when I looked at some of these agents, it was literally, okay, here's a forced template or a sample. You get to put your text. You can't modify the workflow. And I guess the reason it's call it low code is because it doesn't do a lot of things. You can't customize it a lot. How do we feel about that?
Well, yeah. So low code configuration is definitely an ingredient in an agentic platform. And you're right, lower code than what? I was writing machine instructions, assembly to make my C code go faster way back in the day, and that was low. So C was lower code than assembly. But what we really have to have is the ability for us to change the behavior of an automated agent as fast as we can describe the change that we're looking for. If we end up having to use the existing tools of existing vendors that are all, VBS or C# or any scripting language, you end up with every one of the changes you're trying to make to these agents being a coding change, that triggering a software lifecycle, which causes the drag and friction that will never get us out of the backlog. So an agentic platform does need low code configuration. In fact, it needs, in our view, nothing like code configuration, because you've got to be able to describe the outcome you want that agent to perform as a conversation among people, systems, and AI. People are invariably necessary, right? And system capabilities are, and if we're going to really pull this off, we're going to transform it with AI. That whole configuration of that outcome needs to be describable as a conversation with conversation constructs, in our view, not in a scripting language from some existing tool that frankly isn't all that different than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah. So what's interesting is I've looked at some of these and they're blankets and API integration. It's just API integration. And we know that's actually a little complicated to do. You and I have been doing it since 2005, right? And then they say, but they've built a couple helpers like, well, for our internal data, like in Salesforce, we can get to our data cloud, or our internal data, SharePoint, Microsoft can get to. But there's a lot more to actually getting data and context in a process. And it can't just be, I just said it's low code, but now give me an API. A developer has to write an API. I don't care what you say, right?
Yeah, Chris, you're on the right path here. And of course you would know, because you and I together have been working on this since 2005, and for a couple decades before I'd been as well as you. This is a big topic because most of the transformation we're trying to have from a technology perspective ends up mired in the integration layer. And that's something that we really had to think very, very differently about at Krista in order to accomplish what we just described a minute ago with nothing like code configuration of autonomous agents. So what we did that is quite the antithesis of the so-called API integration technology that's on the market today, that's described as an integration platform as a service, is that we don't think APIs. We think natural language. We don't think, let's see if we can figure out how to use the technology. We make the technology figure out us. And what we describe instead of an integration platform as a service that gathers all the APIs of underlying systems and reflects that up into an API layer that then you get to start building applications with. And as you said, Chris, writing code to do so. We do the exact opposite. We apply the taxonomy of a domain onto a system in that domain. And when we build that connector is translating the human language, nouns and verbs, et cetera, into the ability to invoke those nouns and verbs on the underlying system. And that gives us a natural language layer, not an API bus, that one could be used by a business person and one must be used by a development team. And that will be the Achilles heel of all of these platforms that will not only be 5 years later coming to market than Krista, but will change much slower than Krista, because our velocity is in part because of that ability to integrate so much more effectively. So those other platforms are going to have to ditch the 2019, 2018 approach to integration, and they're going to have to get with it.
Yep. So one thing I noticed, so very template oriented or examples. And so we do it very differently. Chris said, like one template will say, well, this works in SMS and Slack because it's a chat template. Another template is for email reading. And then the Microsoft Copilots right now, they're all internal. The autonomous hasn't been released yet. We'll see what happens next quarter. But multi-channel engagement, why would anybody want and say a conversation, because they're using the word, to be a single channel? That just blows my mind. If it's an autonomous agent and an agentic platform, why are they single sourcing those?
Yeah, well, Chris, you have to recognize that a developer is writing code to an API to actually implement that low-code configuration of an autonomous agent. And when he or she is doing that, they have to pick either the SMS APIs or the email APIs or the whatever APIs, because what they haven't done is abstracted the notion of that outcome they're trying to achieve sufficiently to describe it purely as a conversation. Whether that conversation takes place over a VoIP style connection like you and I are having now, or whether it's through email or text or pure voice live. All of those are capable with Krista because we had the foresight and thought, and they will too. They'll eventually catch up to us and we'll be at a totally different place then, right? But there's a notion of, wait a minute, this outcome needs to be defined completely irrespective of the channels in which it's going to be conversed with people. And in fact, you may have it inbound from a customer on a chatbot on the website, and you may be trading emails with leadership in in the same outcome, and that's completely natural, right? Where you need even one outcome to be multi-channel itself. So the point here is, when you really get to the level of maturity, and thank goodness we've reached that, where we can define these agent outcomes in such a way that they can then be delivered through whatever channel or combination of channels is desired, really puts you in a great place. The other guys, unfortunately, are rehashing existing tech of their API-based programming and scripting-based automation tools. And of course, they don't have the ability to do it the way that Krista can.
Yep. So, Chris, we, like you said, we naturally talk about an outcome: people, systems, and AI. So we've talked a little about APIs and systems, but human escalation. I find it interesting that this is something that it's now being added to other tools, that it's the importance of that. So, but my fear is that, is it going to be as complicated as like coding a chat to interact with someone? Or like what's it going to look like, and what should it actually look like?
Yeah. This is one of those areas that it still befuddles me. And because actually, let's go back in time. The BPM movement that largely failed because it just was too much a heavy lift on the integration layer. But the concept of human workflow and the work queue was fantastic. Well, what has taken the place? Email. Email is a horrible workflow management tool for people, and it's a terrible work queue, because for every meaningful piece of work I get requested to do in an email, I get 100 spam messages and a whole bunch of noise that it always floods out of the way. And even the modern collaboration platforms like a Slack or a Teams is you go into the chat and everything's automatically marked as read. There's no, as in you have read it. There's nothing to that says, no, wait a minute, there's an action here. I need you to confirm you understand it's an action for you, and you need to actually perform it and then validate to me somehow that you performed it. So it doesn't have the notion of a work queue at all. So now what? These other platforms, even though an agentic platform really has got to be good at human integration, right? Human in the loop, and natural, elegant orchestration of multiple people in multiple roles. It's necessary for that to be outcome-oriented. They don't have it. They don't have the ability to do that. They're going to be, unfortunately, they're going to grab the Slack API or the Teams API or the email API, and they're just going to end up in a mess, because the problem with not having the reminders, escalations, role-based, rule-based notion naturally across multiple channels that Krista has, obviously it's going to create some challenges for an in agentic platform to really get to that level. We have been at this for long enough to understand just how important that is. I think they've got a long haul in front of them.
Yeah. So it's interesting. You just said role-based and probably didn't realize I was going to talk about guardrails next. I honestly think looking at these, how other vendors are talking about, we're putting in guardrails. Analysts said we should have them. So we're just going to say the guardrails is you have SharePoint security, which tells me what documents you can read, or you have your, say, Salesforce security layer tells you who's in the database. The guardrails are very much just accessibility to some data. But in the bigger picture, a guardrail is actually maybe hallucination prevention. It's actually more things than that. You know, can you talk about what should really we have in guardrails? Because what I'm seeing in other platforms is kind of, we put it there so there's a bullet point, but they're not talking about it holistically. Is it AI guardrails? Is it workflow guardrails? Is it hallucination prevention? Is it, prevent vendor lock-in problems? There could be 100 guardrails. What do you think the agentic platform should have?
Yeah, so an agentic platform is going to have to really deal with the security, the data and access security very holistically. One layer to that is definitely to make sure that the underlying systems you connect to are properly integrated so that you don't have to create administrator or super user accounts. And then you've just basically undermined everything the underlying system did in terms of security, because now you've got this thing that basically is being deployed widely and has easy access to all of the information and capabilities of the underlying systems. That's probably step one for a bunch of these guys, and because it's development expediency, right? Because there's a heavy lift in programming. In order to establish all the other layers, they're going to just sort of say, all right, well, let's just give this thing a super user account and go. The other layers, and it's probably too much to try to discuss in this particular forum, but I'll give you a couple of insights. The first is you've got to be able for your agent platform to recognize who's allowed to see and do what, even down to the attribute level of a record. Like, if we're going to send a new employee announcement to the whole company, I'm going to grab an employee out of the HR system and I'm going to put that employee's record into a message that goes to everyone in the company. And guess what? Automatically, people who aren't expected to be able to see that person's salary or phone number or home address will not see that. But those who are expected or who do have the right to see those particular attributes of that employee do naturally see that. One single message, every employee can see, but only see the data that is actually allowed for them. And the same thing with the capabilities. Let's change that employee's salary. All right, who has the right to change that employee's salary? An agentic platform that is really working on our behalf at an outcome level is going to be aware of who can do what. We can't only rely on the systems of record because they're only one participant in an outcome. We're going to cross systems necessarily. We're going to cross roles within the organization of people. So we're going to have a much more enlightened concept of what the guardrails are when we recognize that, because all of the files sharing nonsense in SharePoint is not going to prevent an inappropriate use of content in SharePoint unless you have it associated with the actual use case or outcome that you're working on. And only then can you really know if you're putting the proper security in place. So a lot more to discuss on this topic, but hopefully if I did anything I explained, system of record security is super important. Don't undermine it, but it is entirely insufficient in order to get the guardrails up that you really need.
So, John, at Krista, we've been delivering, it turns out, agentic platforms to customers in production since 2019. And there's a nice definition that we talked about at the very beginning of the podcast and kind of worked through that. But since we've been doing this with customers you say in anger is the term in computer software, right? What's missing from their definition? Because it doesn't seem complete.
Well, I think there's a couple of biggest holes. The single biggest hole would be that this is really a reaction by a handful of software companies to generative AI models, and everyone should be reacting to generative AI models. So if I had just said that, I'd make no sense. But what I really mean is an agentic platform that actually delivers sophisticated outcomes is necessarily going to involve many AI capabilities, classification, anomaly detection, lots of regression capabilities. And that is an enormous missing piece, because there's almost always going to be a, what is that? Is this a kind of, or predict this number or date for me? And in order for it to get to the point where it really is autonomous, it's going to have to stop bothering people all that much. And in order for it to do that, it's going to have to be a learning model. Generative AI models are pre-built, and I'm not talking about the silly fine-tuning that is really more about casting weights in one direction versus another. It's not actually a new learning, right? So you've got to have the ability to build AI essentially on the fly from that specific customer use case. You can't go next door and get another customer's model and install it for them. You can't get one from the sky. Your vendor can't give it to you. There's an enormous amount of AI capabilities that are needed to pull this off. We know that. We knew that. We've been building on that. We've had that in the market for years, and it is actually our biggest. Wait, are you seriously telling me you can do that? Right? That's one of those aha moments for customers. So that would be one. The other is there just isn't the kind of velocity these platforms just don't provide the kind of change velocity that is going to be necessary to make them effective. How many times have you been a part of an IT project that you either gave up and went back to Excel, or you use Excel all the way up until you're done with it, and then you put it from Excel into the actual system? How many times? Why? Well, your velocity in changing Excel is stupid fast. Your velocity in changing the system that was supposed to replace your Excel is stupid slow, because you get to put an item on the backlog when you need to change the IT-based system. And when I say IT-based, I mean it's every change requires programming scripting, goes through a development cycle of, okay, let's start up a dev environment, and then let's do some integration testing, and then let's do all of that nonsense, right? If you don't have the velocity to change as quickly as Excel, or at least near, these are going to only take on relatively minor task automation, and we're not really going to move the ball forward. So an autonomous agent that is essentially just a fancier way to expose you to all the gear that a software company's already had, and now they're adding some Gen AI to it, but you're really still in a script everything, hire a dev team, but I just don't see how they're going to get there. And so the customer that is seeing an agentic platform from Krista is going to see something from an outcome perspective radically different than from one of these guys.